Hey everyone, it's Lindsay with High Altitude Astrology, and today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I want to look at the chart of today, which is Wednesday, January 24th, 2018, because I read a recent writing by a woman named Amanda Painter from the website Planet Waves, and she eloquently wrote about something that I've been feeling a lot and trying to put into words myself. And I wanted to just take some quotes from her article and talk about them in this reading in relationship to the chart of today. So her article is titled Liberation and Responsibility with the Sun in Aquarius. And as you all probably know, the sun entered the sign of Aquarius on January 19th of this month. And also Venus has moved into the sign of Aquarius as well. And that happened on the 17th of January. So we're starting to get some shift from Capricornian energy, where the sun and Venus were, into Aquarius. And so she's titled her writing Liberation and Responsibility with the Sun in Aquarius. She says that she calls it this because of the two planets that rule Aquarius, Saturn, which also rules Capricorn, and Uranus. Now, if you know anything about astrological history, Saturn was the old ruler of Aquarius. And then when Uranus was discovered, it became the new ruler of Aquarius. And she says Uranus represents, in part, liberation and unbridled life force, and Saturn represents responsibility and containment. And she says we need both concepts, both forms of energy to live in balance. Then she talks about Martin Luther King. She said he championed these two concepts of Saturn and Uranus, calling from a place of deeply held social and personal responsibility for liberation, which is Uranus, finding the most effective outlet for his considerable life force by focusing it into a clear and singular purpose, one that took as its container the principle of nonviolent protest. By embodying one clear structure of action and philosophy, he sought to dismantle and revolutionize another social and political structure in pursuit of freedom for a repressed group. He did so by inspiring individuals to use their freedom to take personal responsibility, whether they were among the repressed group or among the elite group doing the oppressing. So she's talking about how with this Aquarian energy comes those two parts. One is being the liberator, but Saturn also brings in the necessity for personal responsibility. And she goes on to talk about how at the same time that we've got the sun in Aquarius and Venus in Aquarius, and this is where if you look at the chart of today, she talks about the fact that the asteroid Juno is conjunct the lunar south node in Aquarius. So Juno's at 16 degrees, the lunar south node's at 14 degrees, Venus is at 8 degrees, and the sun is at 4 degrees. All of those energies are in the sign of Aquarius. But then she also talks about how not only is Juno conjunct the south node, but opposite those two energies are the North Node at 14 degrees Leo, plus Ceres at 13 degrees Leo. Now, I personally haven't studied a whole lot about the asteroids. They're sort of newer energy dynamics in astrology. But she goes on to describe a little bit about them, and this is what really hit home with me. She says Juno is in close conjunction to the South Node, and the pair are exactly opposite the asteroid Ceres and the lunar North Node in Leo. I was pondering this opposition and wondered when your sense of what is nourishing and heart-based, which I believe is her description of the Ceres at 13 degrees Leo conjunct the North Node in Leo. So when when your sense of what is nourishing and heart-based is confronted by the kind of social justice by mob mentality that seems to proliferate the internet, how do you negotiate that space? So she's talking about the opposition from the South Node in Aquarius conjunct Juno in Aquarius. And it's kind of like the South Node is where we've come from, but also maybe where we need to let go of as we move more into the North Node energy of that Leonian heart-based energy. The South Node is kind of groupthink in the sign of Aquarius. And perhaps next to Juno, you know, it has something to do with our passions and our sort of ability to kind of allow this groupthink, this as she describes it, mob mentality to kind of take over. And again, she's pointing out ultimately where we have to balance with the energies of Saturn and Uranus, the individual in the midst, the responsibility of the individual in the midst of the collective mind. She goes on to say, the internet, which is arguably symbolized by Uranus, is a hotbed for license. That is, freedom without responsibility. You see, there's the difference. It's freedom, but there's no real kind of holding somebody accountable or responsible for what they do online. You can say almost anything you want on the internet, including on social media, and many, if not most people do, often with very little thought about the impact of our words or whether a hastily comment fully represents their deeper values. With Ceres and Juno opposed, as they are, you might practice toggling back and forth between leading from your compassionate heart space, so that would be the Ceres in Leo, and joining the call for justice with online groupthink. That would be Juno in Aquarius next to the South Node. But she says true groupthink is made up of individuals who think for themselves. If that quality is missing, then you're a part of a mob, and beneficial things rarely emerge from a mob. So again, she's going back to the idea of the Sun in Aquarius and Venus in Aquarius being comprised of Uranus and Saturn, not only require the thinking of the group, but it requires individual responsibility within that. At the same time, in many social justice struggles, there's a strength in numbers. We need to come together in groups and work together to solve problems that are too unwieldy and complex for systemic or systemic for one person to take on all by themselves. In doing so, we have to accept the individual responsibility to think for ourselves, to see the big picture as well as the immediate problem, and to bring our empathy, curiosity, and honesty. She says, I thought about this more today after reading this article in The Guardian about some backlash on social media being directed at Margaret Atwood over some comments she made about retaining due process amidst the hashtag #MeToo movement. Something which she sees overall as a massive wake-up call. Quote, if the legal system is bypassed because it is seen as ineffectual, what will take its place? Who will be the new power brokers? Atwood asked. According to The Guardian, she, quote, raised the possibility that the answer could leave women divided. In times of extremist wins, the ideology becomes a religion. Anyone who doesn't puppet their views is seen as an apostate, a heretic, or a traitor, and moderates in the middle are annihilated, end quote. And then Amanda goes on to say, I still think there's potential for the energy behind the hashtag #MeToo movement to be used constructively if the energy is harnessed individually rather than tribally. But in addition to men being willing to review their actions and attitudes from an often uncomfortable perspective, and to cultivate empathy and real listening skills in communication with women and vice versa, we also need more people, perhaps especially women, to begin thinking in constructive, healing-oriented ways beyond just going on the war path. And she says, from what I can tell, one thing that's challenging about this idea is that it can feel like anyone suggesting this is ignoring or actively trying to silence women who are speaking up about their trauma. And that's not necessarily the case. And this is what I've been trying to discuss through my readings of James Franco and through my readings of Matt Damon, because especially Matt Damon was kind of speaking up and saying, you know, there's a spectrum on this issue of sexual assault, and not everybody should be lumped into the same category. And people were really shutting Matt Damon down, especially women, getting very angry with him for even bringing up the possibility that, you know, there could be some dialogue around that in the conversation. And I think it's very important that we don't prevent a conversation around this by being so dead set on feeling our group think, or what she describes as our tribal mentality around this issue, and alienate men from being part of the conversation. Because the perspective I maintain is that this is really an issue of power. And of course, there are extreme examples where, you know, people were completely powerless and they were taken advantage of. But I also think on this spectrum, there is an issue, and Morrissey was talking about this, especially in like areas of politics and areas of Hollywood. You know, power is the thing that everybody's trying to get. And I think it's hard to admit, possibly, for some women that, you know, we too have been eager to gain power and perhaps have compromised ourselves in certain ways in order to try to get it. You know, that's the very taboo way of looking at this whole issue. And it also comes from our collective consciousness that we've come from as a society, especially from the 50s, where the woman, you know, was less powerful and she found a man in her life to take care of her. And that was kind of, you know, the way that it was. So we've come from this way of making women and women buying into the fact that, you know, we have to figure out how to find our powers in these kind of subversive ways. And I think that's a part of the conversation that needs to be discussed as well. So Amanda goes on to say, the thing is, the healing process, including those initial steps, has to happen on an individual level. And as long as we have ways for individual voices to collect en masse, and as long as we're collectively trying to shift the overall cultural dynamic, which historically has been shitty towards women victims of sexual crimes, then I think we're going to hear a lot more of the #MeToo movement and similar. That's not automatically a bad thing, just as continuing to point out and address racism is not a bad thing, so long as systemic racism and the abuse of sexual power exists. But getting stuck in mob or tribal mentality is an obstacle to individual healing as well as to collective progress. So what she's saying is, if we're always in this mob mentality, this tribal mentality of, men don't understand, and we have the right now to say that we've been taken advantage of, and that our power has been denied to us, and our power has been taken advantage of. We can get stuck. We can get stuck in this way of mass thinking, and then the individual healing doesn't occur because you're identifying constantly with the pain, and constantly with the hurt, and constantly with the feeling of powerlessness, and that it's actually our responsibility to seek out the individual healing in the process. Again, Aquarius, individuality, Uranus, Saturn, our responsibility to seek out the individual healing in this process so that ultimately we can collectively heal through those individual processes. She continues, individuals may move into other stages of healing and then might not need to resort to vigilante social media. And those will be the people able to shift their inner narrative as well as the one they offer publicly. But I don't ever think we're ever going to have everybody moving through the process at the same time. Even so, I'm beginning to see more nuanced conversations about the multivalent issues regarding sexual power dynamics, including the sorry state of communication around sex, dating, flirting, boundaries, desire, and owning it, and so on. It's possible for women and men to bring tremendous empathy and a willingness to take responsibility for their end of the conversation or for their actions to this problem, even on social media. I remind myself, however, to hold space for those who are not at a place in their individual healing where they can engage in the same way, just as I support those who can go there and who can model this process of inquiry. I think that's partly what it means to have a functional group of individuals. And then she finally wraps it up by saying, with Venus in Aquarius, we seem to get another image of the possibility. Indeed, the need to bring some, quote, emotional intelligence into group settings, both online and in person. As just described, a mob has no real intelligence, emotional or otherwise, of its own. For a group to operate humanely, both among its members and toward the larger community, its individual members must bring their own humanity. And I'll wrap it up with something I wrote recently for my local newspaper, because I was involved in planning the Women's March in my town last year, and then I helped a group of women kind of guide them into planning it again this year. And so I have been involved in issues around the kind of the revival of the women's movement. And we're having a mayoral election in this year, and I was watching a mayoral it was a forum, and the only woman out of 5 running for the position of mayor in my city asked a question of a man also running for mayor, and she was commenting on an op-ed that he had written in regards to the hashtag #MeToo movement, and he was saying that if he were mayor, he would create an advisory council that women in the community could come to if they had issues, that they were struggling with around being a woman. And he said that this has been done successfully in other cities, and it's proved to be a very valuable thing. Well, the woman running for mayor said to this man, I feel that women don't need to be on an advisory council, they need to be at the table. And she was indicating in positions of power in government. Well, in my opinion, in his op-ed, he was not saying that women do not deserve to be at the table. He was just trying to say that he supports women in the community and respects that they suffer from certain things because they are a woman, and that an advisory council would be a supportive thing for women. So I wrote an op-ed for my local newspaper. I don't know if it's going to be published, but what I basically said was that to me, it was very obvious he was not subjugating women to only being in the role of an advisory position. And if anything, he made the mistake of not elaborating on his position, because he did answer her question at that debate and basically said, of course I'm for women having, positions in leadership roles in city government, and that he would even take the lead of the Prime Minister of Canada, who I think has some sort of rule that there has to be a balanced number of men and women in those positions. And he said, he would continue to study that and take the lead in that direction. So what I wrote in my op-ed to the newspaper was that we really need to be careful that we don't assume things about men in relation to this whole issue of sexual misconduct, sexual abuse, that we don't alienate men by assuming something about them, assuming that they think in a certain way, assuming that they've behaved in a certain way, or even shutting down the conversation to getting their perspective on something in a situation where we do think something that we were violated. Perhaps there's another perspective that can add more light to the situation. But I do think in this situation that I'm talking about, it's important that we don't shut down the conversation by assuming we understand somebody's perspective, because we potentially eliminate individual and collective growth, as well as prevent the opportunity for us to really join with men in helping to move forward with this, resolving this issue, and preventing it in the future. So that's what I have to say today. Thank you so much for watching. You can subscribe to my channel if you like my videos, and I do readings. Please contact me if you're interested at info@highaltitudeastrology.com. Thanks so much for watching. Adios.